Good morning, and welcome to the San Francisco Interfaith Council online briefing for faith leaders. Today's program highlights the work of the San Francisco Economic Recovery Task Force and looks into the economic impact of COVID-19. This program is hosted by the San Francisco Interfaith Council and supported by the Joint Information Center of the San Francisco COVID Command Center. Audio, video, and chat will be monitored and recorded for record keeping, training purposes, and quality assurance. By default, all participants will be muted and video turned off to minimize distractions. To submit a question or comment, select the chat button at the bottom of your screen and send a message to Q&A. Your questions will be collected and shared with the Interfaith Council for response after the meeting. A reminder that everyone living and working in San Francisco is encouraged to get tested for COVID-19. To learn more, please call 311 or visit sf.gov/gettestedsf. And finally, ongoing stress from the pandemic, racial injustice, wildfires, and grief and loss are real. Maintaining our social connections during times of stress can be a lifesaver. If you could use help managing feelings like depression and anxiety, you can reach out to the Mental Health Talk Line at 855-845-7415 or text the word HOME to 741-741 to connect with a crisis counselor. And once again, welcome to the San Francisco Interfaith Council online briefing for faith leaders. I will now hand it over to Executive Director of the SFIC, Michael Pappas.
Lynn, thank you so very much, and thank you to our amazing team at the COVID Command Center's Joint Information Center Virtual Outreach Team. This is our 23rd program together, and we are very grateful for the support that you give us. Good morning, I'm Michael Pappas, and on behalf of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, I want to welcome you to this morning's online briefing for faith leaders. The coronavirus has already had a major local impact on the San Francisco economy. In response, the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce and a host of other business organizations and leaders have urged federal, state, and local officials to develop an economic recovery package for San Francisco businesses impacted by the evolving situation. Our city's response was the formation of the San Francisco Economic Recovery Task Force. The task force is charged with guiding the city's efforts through the coronavirus recovery to sustain and revive local businesses and employment, mitigate the economic hardships already affecting the most vulnerable San Franciscans, and build a resilient and equitable future. This week's online briefing for faith leaders, hosted by the San Francisco Interfaith Council and supported by the COVID Command Center's Joint Information Center Virtual Outreach Team, welcomes Task Force Co-Chair and President and CEO of the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce, Rodney Fong, who will address San Francisco's economic outlook and the developing work of the Economic Recovery Task Force in these times of the coronavirus. It now gives me great honor and pleasure to welcome the Chairman of the Board of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, my dear friend, Kaushik Roy.
Thank you so much, Michael. My name is Kaushik, and on behalf of the board, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us again for our weekly conversation. I think for a lot of us, it feels like almost on a daily basis, our world is becoming a bit darker. And I think that just highlights the cry that we know is out there for the fundamental values of all of our faiths. And I think not only do we have these great conversations every week, but I think there's an inherent importance to the fact that all of us from all our faiths come together every week to address everything that's going on in our city and beyond. So I want to thank everyone for joining us again. I want to extend my appreciation very quickly to the folks who are joining us that are going to have this great conversation for us today. Rodney, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And we also have a great list of panelists. Lisa and Hilma, Kathleen, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. And I also want to, of course, acknowledge our dynamic duo our staff members, Michael Pappas and Cynthia Zambucas, who are doing an immense job, incredible job of assuring that everything on the Interfaith Council agendas are being achieved and that these conversations are happening so frequently. So thanks to the two of you. If you are joining us for the first time at the beginning of every interfaith meeting or gathering, we do have an interfaith statement that we like to read. So I'll just do that now and then we will proceed. This is an interfaith community. Whatever our individual belief, it can be freely expressed here with no apologies. If we are invited to offer a prayer in this setting, it should be offered according to the tradition with which we identify. If we are invited to speak on a subject from the perspective of our tradition, we are free to do so without fear of offending those who come from another tradition. We come together as people of faith to learn from one another so that we might better understand the multiplicity of faith traditions in our city and in our world. Good morning, everybody.
Thank you, Kaushik. And again, thank you for your leadership and your commitment to being with us each week. I know that it is a great commitment, and your participation and your presence only enriches it. Throughout the pandemic, our faith leaders have played an integral role. They have helped to cultivate community in the midst of isolation, and they have continued to minister to the most vulnerable residents in the city and county of San Francisco. Today, we are very blessed to have with us Rabbi Camille Shira Angel, who I first met when she was serving as the senior rabbi at Congregation Shahar Zahav in the Mission. And now she is the rabbi in residence at the University of San Francisco, which is a wonderful constituent of the council and a collaborator and a partner. And so it gives me great pleasure to welcome Rabbi Camille Shira Angel.
Thank you, Michael, Rita, and the San Francisco Interfaith Council for the work you do on behalf of countless beneficiaries. And thank you for inviting me to participate this morning in this way. As Jews began to observe Rosh Hashanah this last Friday evening, we were saddened to learn that our great bright light of justice, our social justice hero, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, had died. Justice Ginsburg was an inspiration to countless women and men and people of every gender across our nation and around the globe, dedicating her life to equal justice under the law. Cheryl Gay Stolberg in Sunday's New York Times described RBG as elder stateswoman of feminism, a powerhouse octogenarian, one who time and again demonstrated how you can disagree without being disagreeable. When I think of how much Justice Ginsburg has done for women's equality over the course of her career, I know I feel a personal debt of gratitude. I grew up knowing and believing I could be a woman rabbi, a woman anything. RBG helped women break down systemic oppression on the basis of sex, quote, brick by brick. This last May, I celebrated the 25th anniversary of my rabbinic ordination, and this fall marks my 20th anniversary here in San Francisco. My first 15 years were in service to Congregation Sha'ar Zahav, and then over the last 5 years as an educator, teaching at USF in the SWIG program of Jewish Studies and Social Justice. As the university's first full-time rabbi in residence, my research and teaching focuses on how young queer Americans, both Jews and non-Jews, re-explore their roots after having been marginalized due to their LGBT and queer identities. It's in no small part that I get to do what I do on account of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's life's work. Justice Ginsburg was one of the greatest of greats, someone we can refer to in Hebrew as a gedola, a great, long-lasting, impactful woman. As Jews, we blow the ancient sounding tool known as the shofar, a ram's horn, during our high holy days to awaken us to the fierce urgency of now. One of the sounds we make with the shofar is the final blast known as the Tekiah Gedola, the sound that extends beyond what is imaginable and shakes us and awakens us to address the inequities of our time. Remembering Justice Ginsburg with the call of the shofar, let us think of her calling us personally to do our work of civic repair. May we commit to keeping her memory alive by working for justice and equity in our place, in our time. In Waco, Texas, in a candlelight vigil at the county courthouse, people held an 87-second moment of silence, a second for each year of RBG's life. I ask that we now do the same, to pause for 87 seconds of silence to honor Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. May her life's work continue to inspire us and lift us up. From silence back to words. May our words bring understanding, may our actions bring healing, and may our love for each other and all the world inspire us to keep rising for justice and peace. Amen.
Amen. If it is appropriate, allow me to say Shana Tova and wish you a blessed New Year as well as a blessed High Holy Days. God bless you. Thank you. We are very privileged to have with us today a gentleman who I have known for many, many years, and he's worn many, many hats. And if you've not already, I would encourage you to take a look at his vitae that is included in the program. Rodney Fong just began his work most recently as the president and the CEO of the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce. But he has also been assigned, and rightfully so, as the co-chair of the San Francisco Economic Recovery Task Force. With the pandemic, he really needed to land boots on the ground, and we welcome you, Rodney, and turn the floor over to you. Thank you for being with us, and please give us a look into your life and your work and the hopes and aspirations of our city.
Great, thank you, Michael, and very nice seeing everybody here. Somehow I feel like it's a fresh day being in this particular group and this particular presence, so thank you for that. As Michael mentioned, I'm the president and CEO of the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce. And before that, I was a small business owner running our family businesses. Many of you probably know the Wax Museum down at Fisherman's Wharf. And so I grew up here in San Francisco. My parents were born and raised in San Francisco. My grandparents were born and raised in San Francisco. And my great-grandmother was born here in 1898, right here in Chinatown. So we've had the pleasure of seeing San Francisco through all of its lumps and bumps and high times and low times. And in the end, I think I am overall just bullish about San Francisco, and we will come out of this on the other side altogether. But there's a lot of work to be done, which I'll get to now. So as you know, this has been an incredible 6 months or so, and even before COVID-19, the economic landscape of San Francisco was already challenged. We already saw so many vacancies, retail vacancies, people frustrated with the conditions of the streets, people threatening to leave San Francisco, and we're starting to obviously see some of that right now. The role of the chamber during the pandemic has really been to try to keep businesses afloat. And by keeping businesses afloat, we're trying to keep people employed here in San Francisco. This is a very scary thing, as we all know, that there are over 200,000 unemployment claims here in San Francisco, many of them vulnerable, as we all deal with on a daily basis. But I think there's a whole nother population that is potentially vulnerable that we need to keep our eye on. We all have friends, neighbors, cousins, a niece that's unemployed right now. In 6-7 months, they can maybe survive that. But we, I think, are getting into a point here where some of the assistance, the federal or state or local assistance is going to begin to run out. And so we need to look for this not only second wave of pandemic, but second wave of economic downturn from our neighbors, with our neighbors. If I can just talk a little bit about the pandemic itself and more about its impact. Key highlights to share with you. That San Francisco economy is so unique and rare in that we have so much creativity and ingenuity here in San Francisco. They're not high-paying jobs necessarily. The hospitality community has been hit the hardest, as we all know, not necessarily high-paying jobs. And so all of those folks are at risk at the moment. We're looking at right now about a 13%, about a 10% unemployment rate here in San Francisco. In the Great Recession, we had a spike of 13% temporarily, but San Francisco over the last few years has been maintained about a 2% unemployment rate. And so that jump to 10% is quite, makes us nervous. The transactions in San Francisco from some of the businesses, and this is some of the data we've collected, 85% of businesses were forced to shut down in San Francisco. Most of these are brick and mortar stores. Almost half of the storefronts in San Francisco are closed. And an aggregate sales number, number shows that more than 95% of businesses are not at normal figures. We are seeing some of the reopenings, starting to occur right now, which is positive and good. Indoor dining just got an announcement last week that they're beginning to reopen, which is positive. Indoor museums. The outdoor scene, as you are seeing, the Shared Streets program, I think are fantastic. It's bringing people together in a safe space, in an outdoor space. And so that is part of the result of the Economic Recovery Task Force. There are more things on that list, which I'll talk about in a second, that need to occur. But the outdoor dining is a piece that we're starting to see and happy with that. A little bit into the future, the Arizona State University in 2019 came out with a survey saying that San Francisco was the most challenging city to do business in. And I think a lot of us know that. It's the most expensive city to do business. It's maybe full of the most red tape going through the permit process to do a simple change from a bookstore to a coffee shop. And that is so important, I think, that we try to break down those barriers. Right now, San Francisco, for this recovery, it's going to take creativity. It's going to take love. It's going to take compassion. It's going to take allowing people maybe to be creative. Over the last 10, 15 years in San Francisco, we've been so regimented about controlling the city. And I know that feels very strange to let go of control, but I think for San Francisco to honestly really recapture what it had before, a city of arts, a city of culture, a city of music, a city of celebration, a city of free speech, we need to let the reins go a little bit. And I say that cautiously, but I think it's such a powerful tool, creativity, to see San Francisco bounce back. Our local landscape obviously is impacted on the business side, but I think the real point that Michael and I shared and want to talk about is the impact to nonprofits. And with so many companies leaving San Francisco, so many employees leaving San Francisco, the Texodus as it's referred to, what does that mean to the philanthropic side? What does that mean to the corporate giving side? What does that even mean to the volunteer pool and base that we have? And as we were talking about, Michael and I earlier, about the sense of community and what this particular council has been able to do, and what the faith-based organizations have been able to do in the middle of crisis, is pull people together. that pool of San Francisco, for us to function, we need everybody here and everybody willing to help out. It's been more apparent to me now than ever, and I come from a different background, business side as well as nonprofit side, but it's been more evident to me in the last 6 months how symbiotic San Francisco really is. From the business side, from the youth side, from the education side, we are all touching each other, we're all impacted, and there's no way one of us is going to run away with this city being their city. It's our city. I personally get a little bit frustrated that we've lost the sense of we. We here in San Francisco, and maybe even in the United States, lost the sense of we, that we're going to do it together. We can all pitch in to do it together, and that sense is a difficult one. Some of the policies that have been suggested or recommended by the Chamber of Commerce, as well as the Economic Recovery Task Force, have been submitted to Mayor London Breed. Mayor Breed has done a great job of supporting and doing everything she can on the policy side. She's got a couple of ballot measures which she signed on to that's hopefully going to help San Francisco. But those policy changes, many of them very small and some of them large, need to be addressed. Figuring out ways how we incentivize business to flourish in San Francisco will help the nonprofit sector here in San Francisco as well. And so, to be honest, I think we also have to be realistic that San Francisco after this pandemic is going to be a little bit different. It might be a lot different. It might be a smaller city. It might be, hopefully not, but a less pedestrian-friendly city for a while. I know all of us here are concerned and deal with the street conditions and our homeless and mental health and drug use problems in the city. That has to be addressed. And I know many people are spending time and money on that. We're about to get another $472 million from the Prop C fund to go to that. That has to, I think, cover a lot of range of immediate needs today, but also address some of the permanent long-term needs and face some of the realities that we have in front of us to make this city better. The street conditions in the city are a major factor to the possibility of economic recovery here in San Francisco. We've lost many conventions because of that. Many folks have left San Francisco as a large part of the street conditions. And so I think we really need to be aware of that. The other thing that's probably going to change significantly is San Francisco. We've had the luxury of being the golden child for the last 18 years or so, 20 years. We have two great universities, Stanford and Cal Berkeley, which I believe are really sort of the impetus of why San Francisco is successful. That education, that talent, that collaboration, which then turned into to investment money and access to investment capital, allowed San Francisco to flourish. What we're challenged now with is people working remotely. And that sense of city, at least for the time being, that sense of hub of innovation, not necessarily being top notch or being top of the list. And so San Francisco going forward will have to think about what's its next value proposition. What makes San Francisco unique? What makes people want to invest here? What makes people want to live here? And some of those things I think we need to really figure out what we're going to be in 2030. And many of us are talking about that roadmap. What's the next decade look like for us? And if we can be, clever about it, thoughtful about it from a land use perspective, I think this last 10 years we caught ourselves with this big tech boom, which was great and also cumbersome. I don't think 10 years ago we thought about attracting that business, but we didn't think about the infrastructure. We didn't think about the need for affordable housing, for example. We didn't think about the need and the pressures on transit, what that meant to our city, packing it in and growing it to 1.1 million from a 600,000 number. So going forward, what's that new San Francisco going to look like, and how can we get ahead of the curve and start to build some of those things back to support that infrastructure and not get caught behind it? All that work ahead is going to be so much on not just our elected officials. They're under tremendous pressure. I think many of them who came into office, like all of us, didn't expect to be in this position. Don't necessarily, no knock on anybody, including ourselves here, we didn't have this kind of experience or skill set before. And so we're all learning this. And to some degree, it is all of our first rodeo together. And I think sometimes it's better if we all just acknowledge it's our first rodeo and take some of the pressure off of us and collaborate together. But there's going to be pressure on the mayor. There's going to be pressure on the board of supervisors. And I think folks like myself in this group here are going to be city leaders. We were before, and we're going to have to be even more so now. We're going to have to step up and try to help out and drive the city in the right direction. And as we all know, this is a tough city to deal with. Patience is going to be required by everybody. And I'll ask this group to help spread that word about patience and compassion and looking out for each other as we grow together and stumble together. Some of the things about retaining business here in San Francisco, that is job number one, is to hold on to what you have. And that refers to the nonprofits as well. We need to hold down, hang tight, support. The second piece that San Francisco is going to need to do is attract business. And we haven't had to be in that business of luring people to San Francisco. But I think we're going to be in that position now. What's kind of interesting, earlier I read that stat from the University of Arizona or Arizona State, and saying that San Francisco was the toughest city. Well, very well, that could have been Arizona's way of attracting business to Arizona. And they have actually been quite successful in luring tech companies to Arizona, and that might have been part of the ply. So we've got to do, not maybe that tactic, but similar sort of tactics where we're thinking about the future, thinking about what's around the corner. Is it biomedicine? Is it telemedicine? Is it life sciences? All of this stimulation, all this energy needs to be harnessed and focused where we want to go. I'm going to sort of stop there, Michael. I really kind of wanted this conversation just to be an open dialogue and have some discussion, answer some questions. The Chamber of Commerce doesn't have the answers to everything, but we certainly are ones to ask the question and ask provocative questions and steer people into deep thought and leadership. And I'll end by just again commenting about the sense of we, and really hope and appreciate this group for being always so positive, optimistic, there to catch somebody when they need help, because there are a lot of people that definitely need help right now, but also just to be positive about San Francisco and the great community that, for those of us who stayed, love San Francisco and are willing to fight for it. So thank you very much, Michael.
Rodney, thank you. I'm going to ask you a personal question before we get started. I just remember being with you at Grace Lights at Grace Cathedral, and if you could just spend a moment to talk about your connection with the place, because I thought it was fascinating.
For any of those of you who saw the Ben Davis's Grace Lights, there, that beautiful projection in the smoke and the incense in that tall cathedral, it really just struck us because my grandfather, who had immigrated here as a young boy with just classic story, nothing in his pocket, one of his first jobs was being a houseboy inside Grace Cathedral. And he had worked for the family that was living there. And kind of a funny story, he wasn't really used to wearing hard shoes and was carrying a tray of tea to a room and had tripped on one of the many, many beautiful carpets, rugs that was there, and dropped the tray, and he thought he was going to be fired for sure. So he ended up leaving there. The irony is that my grandfather became quite successful and quite, I guess, well-liked or received in San Francisco. And so in his passing, when he was 86 years old, his funeral service was there in Grace Cathedral. And no one, that place was packed, and no one really knew the history that he had worked there except for the family. And so I had to see that Grace Lights exhibit there, and almost a lifting experience through art had really touched us. And so Michael was there, and he probably saw me crying and weeping, but thank you for...
It was a great San Francisco story. And
yeah.
I really think that the Chamber of Commerce is very, very fortunate to have you in the role you are now. I think the Jews would call it beshert. And we are here to support you as well. You did speak about the symbiosis of the corporate community, the business community, as well as the nonprofit community. By way of introduction, we have some amazing panelists with us today who are going to talk about how their organizations have been impacted and their ability to serve their clients. Back in 2008, when the Great Recession began, a number of our faith-based social service agencies doing business with the city, the contracts were there. And I remember Mayor Lee saying back in 2011 that those budgets had to be cut by about 30%. So overnight we saw staff and programs just disappear. Fast forward, tech came in, and those budgets had never been fully restored. And all of a sudden, a lot of these agencies went to go renew their leases. And what we found was there was a displacement. Some of them just lost their leases. Some of them found great spots, but had to invest an awful lot to rehabilitate the space. A number had to downsize. And with that, we also had the issue of retention and recruitment of staff in order to provide for the safety net for the most vulnerable citizens and residents in San Francisco. So the council began to convene what we call the Faith-Based Social Service Agency CEO Roundtable. I think in terms of what we are talking about today, we have assembled the best and the brightest from those who are training others for employment, to others who are providing for those on the streets, and to others who are doing funding of grantees. We start off with Lisa Countryman, who, like yourself, Rodney, is just landed boots on the ground she's the Chief Executive Officer at Jewish Vocational Service, which really is training folks for the workforce here in San Francisco. Lisa, we welcome you. My respect for you is incredible. It has grown since the pandemic, of course. JVS is our shining jewel. And so if you would share with us a little bit about how your work has been impacted, the work of the agency, your clients, and the communities you serve, we would be very, very appreciative.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Cynthia and Lynn, for the work that you're doing to pull everyone together. And thank you, Rodney, for your comments. It's just such a great reminder of how much skill, talent, and will there is in San Francisco to build back better. And I remain apprehensive about the future, but also optimistic that we can get it done. So thank you for inviting me to speak. I do want to begin just by providing a little bit of context. This is reinforcing really some of the things that Rodney had to say, comparing this situation to the Great Recession. And I think some of the numbers are so stark that it's important to remember really the depth of the challenge that we're facing. The job losses that we've seen in California under COVID have been nearly twice that of the Great Recession. So we have just over 2 million people who've lost jobs between February and June, compared to just over 1 million who lost employment in California between December of 2007 and January of 2010. So it is just really incredible, the numbers of people who've lost jobs. And in San Francisco, the employment rate decreased by about 26% between January and July. And we know that so many of those people who lost employment or who lost hours are low-income people of color. And so that is exactly where JVS is placing really the center of our concern. And we, even since pre-pandemic, we have been starting to look at, because of the growing gap between haves and have-nots, we've been really anchoring our work not just to how do we get people a job, how do we get people into a certain wage, but really looking at working with our clients over a longer period of time to ensure that we're supporting economic mobility. We know that the numbers of working poor, not just in San Francisco, but across the country are so great. We really need to be thinking about economic mobility and economic mobility really with a racial equity lens as well. So that's where a lot of our work is going, kind of focusing down more closely on JVS. I also want to say that when the pandemic hit at the end of March, we did a massive client needs assessment survey. We ran that survey at the end of March. We ran it again in May. We ran it again in August, and we're going to be running it again in October so that we can really stay abreast of what's going on with our clients. And again, the numbers are stark and shocking. More than 70% of our clients have responded that they are concerned about housing instability and food insecurity. When we first ran the survey in March, it was really to understand what our clients' needs were and to be able to respond best. When we saw those numbers and we saw that level of need, we launched an emergency fundraising campaign of $1 million, and our goal was to, between March and June, raise $1 million to respond to these most urgent needs, which we put into kind of 3 buckets. The first was emergency cash support for our clients, which is something we'd never really done before. The other was getting our clients laptops and access to Wi-Fi to make sure that they could participate in programs if they were kind of on the wrong side of the digital divide. And the third was to develop, create, and launch new programs. We were really pleased that we overshot our goal. We raised $1.1 million, and between April and July, we're able to give out about $250,000 in cash supports to our clients, fulfilling 98% of our client requests. And the vast majority of those requests were for utility bills, for rent support, for food. So really just the basic necessities of living. That was completely new for us. We did share our processes with some of our other nonprofit partners because that was challenging to figure out as well, since we'd never done that before. But of course, that solved the problems of a few months ago. And without a second major round of stimulus, we're looking to, what is the next wave, particularly as we're coming up on eviction moratorium ending and the end of the additional $600 that folks were getting through UI. In addition, many respondents said that they had already been living paycheck to paycheck. About half of our survey respondents said that someone else in their household had lost employment or hours, and over 60% in our August survey responded that the school closures were affecting their ability to look for work. So one of the most devastating things about this for our work and for our staff is that folks that we had just placed in November, December, January, February in jobs, in great jobs after going through training with JVS, had been laid off. And so really the spring and summer has been about, not just working with new folks, but really reworking with folks we had recently supported. On the hopeful side, in terms of our client survey, we are seeing that our clients really understand that a combination of skill building and direct connections to employers, it is what they most need to get employed again. And that's really at the center of our work. I think the challenging piece about this is that this has been called a K-shaped recovery. So folks who were already working in the tech industry, folks who already had white-collar jobs, for the most part, are still working or working again, and folks at the lower end of the income spectrum are not working. And that is really concerning for us when we think about recessions past. Typically what happens is permanent elimination of some job classifications. So some jobs just go away. Increased skills expectations for those jobs that continue to exist. So in response to that, we are looking at increasing our digital skills training, integrating those digital skills training courses across all of our sector-based programs. That's coming out of research that we've done in partnership with Accenture last summer and then again this summer. And an additional risk that we've seen from past recessions has been just a deeper entrenchment of generational poverty. So that again really lifts up the necessity for us to be focusing on economic mobility, longer term engagement with folks. Looking ahead, I think some of our biggest concerns, are about a third of our funding comes from public contracts, local, state, and federal. And this year we're in pretty good shape. But we're really concerned about the decreases in negative impact to public funding in the next year and in the next couple of years. So that's a real area of focus for us. And the other thing is something else that Rodney alluded to, which is sometimes I think about it as the flattening of the job market. So with so many tech companies deciding that folks can work remotely forever, then they can be hiring people in Reno and in Phoenix and in Nashville. And it really changes the kind of pressures, the positive pressures that exist in the city to think about investing in local talent and training. And just more broadly, the potential flight of employers to other lower cost of living locations. So those are some urgent and long-term concerns that we have. We are thinking a lot about, I mentioned that, in the past and in the last recession, we thought a lot about, okay, all these people have been laid off. Many of them are coming from kind of middle management, white collar roles in the last recession. We have to get them reemployed. We have to get them back into the workforce. And now we're really looking at how do we attach people to the workforce in ways that will result in their longer term prosperity. So we're really talking about longer term engagements with folks. And we're looking at the integration of workforce development and economic development. I think they cannot be thought of separately. We really need to be thinking about them together. And so for Rodney, I'd like to ask, when you think about that integration of workforce development and economic development, how is the business community and the chamber specifically engaging around this? And what commitments do you see folks making or ready to make to create a local economy that works?
Good question. And actually, Lisa, you and I talked about this very thing just pre-COVID. And that is, and it's an age-old challenge, but getting the private sector and academia to come together to try to as best forecast what jobs are going to be needed down the road, and to set up those academic stations, whether they're through great organizations like yourself or through City College or USF State. And I think in a weird way, when we had that conversation, this is the impetus for that conversation and that program to begin. The Chamber's reaching out to all of its private business members to help solve those questions. It's a little bit difficult because you do need some crystal ball activity, look down the pathway to see what's coming our way and what jobs are needed. But it is one of our greatest concerns of that is, what do we do with that person who's 50 years old and worked in a hotel for 30 years? What are they going to do next exactly, and how we train them? So it's on top of our mind. The Chamber's working hard on an internal program we call Unite SF, which is our workforce program. After this, I have a meeting with also Accenture, who's been a great partner of ours, trying to lay out that roadmap for workforce.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Rodney. Now moving over to Catholic Charities of San Francisco Marin and San Mateo, we welcome Hilma Meneses, who is the CEO.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I really am honored that you would allow me a few minutes today. I really appreciate Rodney's points, and Lisa's, by the way. And Lisa, you took my question, so I'll have to pivot at the end of this. But, but anyway, I'd like to share a little bit with you. As most of you know, Catholic Charities has always stood with those facing some of life's greatest needs and hardships and unthinkable obstacles. And we were founded by a group of sisters, Daughters of Charity, followed by the Dominican Sisters, followed by support from Little Children's Aid, a group of lay women in San Francisco. Our founders sacrificed so much of themselves to serve vulnerable children and families. And today, 2020, our essential workers, several hundred of them, are also self-sacrificing servant leaders, especially in the middle of the pandemic. And by the way, 70% of our workforce are people of color, and 85% of our clients are people of color. In the last 3 years, Catholic Charities has reminded us that we serve everyone. They reminded the entire community that we serve everyone, regardless of faith, gender, race, ethnicity, gender identity. We truly serve everyone. Catholic Charities creates lasting, data-driven solutions to some of the most pressing challenges, right? Such as homelessness, educational disparities, aging and isolation, generational poverty, HIV, AIDS, and immigration, to name a few. The pandemic has only made the agency more resilient, however, committed to serving just like we did in 1906 with the earthquake and during the 1918 flu epidemic, the Depression, etc., AIDS epidemic, world wars. Today is no different. In fact, I would say on a normal year, we serve about 35,000 people. Annualized during this pandemic, we probably will have served about 60,000. I will discuss in a moment some of the efforts that we're doing during the pandemic. But first, allow me to tell you that we activated our incident command even before local jurisdictions or other entities. We did that in late February, and we knew what was coming. We figured that it could be bad, and it was very important to us that particularly our residential care facilities where we have chronically ill individuals with AIDS and other illnesses, and our other residential care facilities, including shelters and homes for children. We needed to keep that virus out. So we started working very hard using protective protocols, not just masks, but face shields, gloves, temperature taking, screening, health screening, and much more. We absolutely we were very fearful that that virus was going to enter our facilities. And surely enough, because of the state that we're in, it tried. And at one facility, we had a few cases where we immediately worked with the Department of Public Health in Marin. This was in Marin. And they immediately came in, tested 120 plus people within 24 hours, and then continually came back to test others. So we were able to control that and have been able to do that since then. As the pandemic has continued, we continue to partner with jurisdictions, foundations, and individuals to deliver these critically needed new services. Programs range, as I may now share with you, from running the largest shelter-in-place hotel for families lacking stable shelter. In fact, in one of the San Francisco hotel that we're helping run, 27 women, pregnant women among those families are living in our hotel. And in the last month and a half, 8 of those women have had babies. So we have 8 newborns in one of our facilities. And that's a blessing to us that these women had a place to be safe instead of on the streets when their newborns came. But anyway, we've also seen a growing number, like Lisa mentioned, of need of food. Food security and basic needs is immense right now during the pandemic. And at one point we were distributing at about 1,700 meals per week. We gave out over $4 million in food support through one of our programs. And luckily through the state of California, we were able to also distribute about $4 million to undocumented families for food and rental assistance. And some of those distributions don't involve monies back to Catholic Charities. It's all direct monies that go directly to the clients, and we're happy to do that. But again, it does still impact our programs in other ways. And we continue to serve in our Bayview and Mission access points where we try to prevent homelessness. But I have to say, the homelessness is increasing, and as I mentioned, our clients are about 85% people of color, normally in the very lowest income bracket. Now it is growing to what used to be middle America, people who, because of the growing number of folks losing their jobs, that is expanding. Chart, very difficult to see our brothers and sisters suffering right now. We have pivoted some of our programs. We've had to. For the less essential programs, we temporarily suspended some of those. And that, for example, because of the school closure, some of our youth after school programs were temporarily suspended, as is our athletic program and our transportation division. That resulted in the last quarter of fiscal year in about a $3 million deficit for us, which is pretty drastic when we are needed the most. But again, we continue to partner with the city of San Francisco and other jurisdictions, and we won't stop. We will continue. Unfortunately, those closures are going to have the suspensions of some of those closures are going to have some long effects on us. But again, we are resilient. We're going to be here. one way or the other. And some of the partners are here in this call, I imagine, because our partners don't only include jurisdictions, but other nonprofits who are doing similar work. The beauty of servant leaders is that they work together, and that's immense. Sometimes people ask us, well, what are your competitors doing? Well, no, other nonprofits are not our competitors. We work together. The need is so great, there's no competition here. We all have to join hands and do the very best we can. There's no shortage of need, unfortunately. But like Catholic Charities is resilient, San Francisco is resilient too. So I appreciate the partnerships that we have throughout. I appreciate all of you in the faith community for standing together. And also to Rodney for your words and how the business and private and local communities are having to work together. So thank you. Should I ask Rodney my question, my pivoted question?
This is it. This is the time.
Okay, Rodney.
The question is too tough.
I kind of have to make it up, right?
Go for it.
So again, understanding that businesses have to come together with the nonprofits. How do we, and understanding that businesses have moved out, especially the large corporations, because of the pandemic, they've had to, are working remotely. Some are, Twitter, for example, has indicated that they're not coming back until maybe next summer, okay? And like Twitter, others as well, they're not coming back to the city. They are going to continue working remotely throughout the year and maybe longer. And as Lisa pointed out, with the remote work, who knows if they're ever really, truly coming back. So how do we incentivize businesses who still have somewhat of a presence, if not a complete presence, to partner with particularly the faith communities and the nonprofits, so not to ignore the need that continues and will continue for years to come because of the pandemic?
That is a great question, and the big question. I think over the last 10 years, we've all been frustrated of how we capture, how we could have captured, should have captured tech money that flowed through San Francisco. And the frustration I think that we had with, I hate to lump it in, but tech not rooting itself or investing back into San Francisco. From the Board of Supervisors perspective in City Hall, taxation is the way to do that. I think that is one mechanism, and that's not going away. But I think we need to create incentives where companies are incentivized to grow in San Francisco, but to invest into our hospitals. It sounds so basic and classic. Invest into our school system, invest into our faith groups, invest into our community centers, and really think about the next generation. This sounds very cliche, but if you start to think about the kids and who's going to live here beyond us, you really start to reevaluate where your efforts are. I know it's strange for me to say this to a faith group, based group, but becoming more involved with what's going on and advocating for business. And I want to dispel any rumors before. When we said the word business before, a lot of us default to the big name brands, so the big logos on the buildings. In this case, it's small business. It's some of those big logos, but it's also a majority of people who filled those office buildings who we've never heard about. And their office size is 1,000 people, 1,500 people. And because of the nature of the business, they deliberately wanted to be quiet and stealthy and not have their name out there. All of those, not all of them, many of them are quietly slipping away. And those are the ones I'm most concerned about, less so the big flashy logo ones. And of course, the small businesses who are, on the ground, and those people are the most vulnerable. So I know it sounds strange for this particular group to start to follow and support business as a category, but it's so important because that funds the once was $13 billion San Francisco had for many of the great services that we need and want and require. And so if we turn our eye away from that and don't support that business growth, that not overly successful, but just moderately successful business community in San Francisco, the nonprofit groups will survive. The arts groups will have a better chance of surviving. If it all crumbles economically, it's not good for all of us, and we know that. So it sounds strange, but follow what's going on in the ballot measures locally. you know, something as what maybe seems like someone's going to do it, following the digital divide and being an advocate for San Francisco adopting 5G wireless technology in the city, we will get left behind by other cities who have faster internet than us. We will get left behind by small cities. Bend, Oregon has got faster internet than us. That is a competitive piece that we all need. And to Lisa's other question about workforce, we've got to have the broadband speed to be able to keep up. It's the new electricity. And we've been spoiled here in San Francisco. I'll end by, we've been spoiled in San Francisco and haven't necessarily had to follow some of the political issues as closely as we have. Kind of getting away with not knowing what district you live in, kind of getting away with not knowing who your supervisor is. It's time for all of us who live in San Francisco and have business in San Francisco to really pay attention to that. And I don't say that from a political point of view. I truly say it from a sense of community, a sense of we all have to get involved. We all have to pay attention and love our city and take care of her because she's hurting right now.
Rodney, it doesn't sound strange at all. And on that note, we were very intentional when we assembled this panel, because sometimes when people think about the faith community, they think narrowly of the congregations. But here you see we've got those who are training those to get into the workforce, a faith-based organization. You have those who are boots on the ground, providing direct services to the most vulnerable. Now we shift to a funder, actually, to talk about how they've been impacted as well as their grantees. And with that, my dear friend Kathleen Perino, who I met when I first went on the Episcopal Charities Board. I think that I'm dating myself. Since then, Episcopal Charities has evolved into the Episcopal Impact Fund. Kathleen, take it away.
Thank you very much, Michael. And it's been wonderful hearing from Lisa and Huma about amazing work that you're doing, which you share with many of the grantees that we are honored to fund, particularly this year in this crisis. As Michael said, we are primarily a funder of organizations that are addressing the root causes of poverty. We are particularly focused on generational poverty, and we fund organizations throughout the 5-county Bay Area, so not just in San Francisco. In San Francisco, we also are a major funder of the old St. Luke's Hospital, where we founded and continue to fund a perinatal mental health care program there that serves all women who are seeking maternity services without regard to the ability to pay. Normally, our grant making follows a pretty predictable pattern. We solicit applications, we review them very carefully, we look at metrics and financials. We do a lot of talking. We spend some time lamenting that we don't have even more money to give away because we have to make difficult decisions. But this year, obviously, everything was upended, everything was changed. We continued to make our core grants following the pattern that I mentioned, but we knew we had to do more in the face of COVID and the incredible stress that our grantees were under. We had learned something from the Great Recession, as many of us did, when the problems were compounded by the fact that many funders pulled back their funding at just the time when even more was needed. It was a knock-on effect that really compounded the terrible experience that so many people, the boots on the ground, were experiencing. So we began over the past few years to accumulate what we called a liquidity fund or a rainy day fund. We never settled on just the right title for it, to be held in cash so it could be kept separate from the vagaries of the market, and to be essentially emptied if we came across something that was the functional equivalent of the Great Recession. We certainly were not expecting a pandemic, but we were expecting something. We knew that something would come. So in late February and early March, it became clear to us that this was the time to deploy this fund. I had running in my head all the time the words of the great teacher Hillel, if not now, then when? So clearly this was the time to take some risks and to make some grants that we normally wouldn't make. So we decided to deploy our funding in two different ways. First, we reached out to all of our traditional partners, people we were in granting relationships with at the time, or that we had previously been in granting relationships with, or that we had a connection to. We sent them an email. We said, tell us what's going on. Tell us how COVID is affecting what you're doing. And tell us what you would do with a grant from us, and tell us how much you want. And so that was probably the simplest grant making process we had ever been through. And we got some amazing stories from our partners. We heard both, of course, of the incredibly increased demand on their services. We've all seen pictures of the food bank lines going out circling around the block many times. We know that, as both Lisa and Helma were talking about, that people needed cash assistance right then and there. Their bills were coming due. They couldn't wait for a lengthy process to get help. We also heard about how much more expensive providing services was becoming in the face of the pandemic. Organizations had to pivot from, say, a congregate meal where they had a line and people went through it and were served a hot meal at tables. That couldn't happen anymore, but people were still hungry, of course. So what they had to pivot to was preparing packaged meals. They also had to take care of their employees, and that is one of the most heartening stories that we've heard over and over again, is just how much risk, how much work, how much ingenuity went into keeping as many people employed as possible and keeping them as safe as possible. For example, one of our long-standing partners, Episcopal Community Services, they started renting hotel rooms for some of their essential workers who had to come into work, but maybe lived with an elderly parent or with an immunocompromised family member. They couldn't go home at night without risking the health of their family members. So Episcopal Community Services did everything that it could to find them safe places to live during the pandemic. Of course, in addition to that aspect, there was also the transportation aspect. People were worried about taking public transportation. So they provided transportation vouchers. And of course, this is all very expensive. And a double whammy. And then the third part of it, which I don't know if the other panelists here have experienced, is having canceled fundraisers. Before we learned how to take everything online, a lot of organizations just said, we can't do it. It is a very steep learning curve to learn how to do an online fundraiser. We have ours on October 30th, so we're all in the anxiety phase of fundraising. So we greatly increased, we really more than doubled our funding to our community-based organizations. But then being a faith-based organization, we had a secret weapon, which we sometimes refer to as our churches. Every one of our churches has what we call a discretionary fund. It's kind of a slush fund for good, if you want to call it that our priests are able to use to address needs, both of their own parishioners, but even more frequently, I believe, people outside of their churches. So people who are experiencing great economic distress will call a local church and say, I need to stay in a hotel tonight. Can you give me a voucher? Or I don't have anything to eat. Do you have a gift card for me? And it's very grassroots. It's very low bureaucracy, low barriers to entry kind of program. So we just sent checks to all of our churches, to every one of the discretionary funds. We said, we ask that you kind of track what you do with this, in rough terms, and that you get it out as quickly as you can. So that was a great delivery service that we already had in our back pockets that we had not really thought about using that way. So when I look at, and by the way, we are in the discussion phase, but we plan to continue both of these programs into 2021, because nothing is telling us that this is going to end or get significantly better in 2021. And in fact, as other people have pointed out, with the end of the eviction moratorium and with the inability of the federal government seemingly to have a second wave of response, we expect that things may get substantially worse. We're particularly concerned next year, and that this is what my question to Rodney is, about a potential surge in family homelessness. We think that many people have no resources to continue their housing. And we expect that to be hitting very dramatically very soon. And I guess my question for Rodney is, is the task force or is the chamber focused on this? Because this is a problem that government definitely has to be involved in solving for all of us.
It's a very good question. And I love your conservative approach in having cash reserve, held in reserve for this or an earthquake or something coming. I think your spider senses are up on this as well, that there is going to be a second wave of economic downturn. And that largely comes to when real estate and foreclosures begin to happen, whether that's people not being able to make their rent, not just their rent, but their mortgage payments and having to give up their home or their apartment building to a bank. For commercial landlords who maybe have a shop down below that's asking for rent relief and they just don't have who has a year worth of cash reserves sitting on hand. So I think that is going to happen. The bailout for the real estate side at the moment doesn't appear to be so clear from government, whether the federal government's going to bail out banks to help them downstream help commercial buildings who then help the tenants in the commercial buildings. And then the ongoing unemployment on top of that is of concern. It's on our radar. We are being as squeaky as we can in conversations like this, but also in larger conversations, just giving that forewarning that it is coming. And I think in a city like San Francisco, where the cost of living is higher, that maybe we are the first to see that topple effect, as opposed to maybe a smaller town that the cost of living is bearable and someone can ride out maybe 2 years, 18 months, where we can't ride out more than 8 months here without employment picking back up. So I think you're spot on. Again, I think it's an opportunity for the unlikely folks to, I shouldn't use that word, but the folks that don't come first to mind to wave that flag about economic troubles coming ahead yet further. The second wave could really be bigger than the first one for us as a city, economically speaking. And so I'm just as nervous about that as you are, and thank you for bringing that up.
This has been a very rich, illuminating, and comprehensive conversation. I never know what is going to be said, but so much has been said here today. And so I want to say a very, very special thank you in particular to Rodney for taking this, giving us this gift of time and sharing with us your expertise. Thank you. And please extend our greetings to the task force members and certainly the folks at the chamber. I want to say a very special thank you to Lisa, Hilma, and Kathleen for bringing these unique perspectives. I think Rodney will probably take them back with him in his work. And certainly to Kaushik and to Rabbi Angel, thank you for grounding us this morning. As we're saying thank yous, I want to thank certainly Cynthia Zambucas, the program associate, administrative associate at the San Francisco Interfaith Council, without whom I would be lost, and who helps with the technical work especially. And also the COVID Command Center's Joint Information Center Virtual Outreach Team. The coordinator, John McKnight, also happens to be the treasurer of the San Francisco Interfaith Council. But to Lynn Mays, who is our producer, assisted by Sharon Walton, and today Jack Chen, a very special thank you. I did want to tell our listeners that next week we're going to have a very different format and a very different program. We are going to be welcoming our public health officer, Dr. Tomas Aragon, who is going to be joining us to allay confusion and to talk to us about the process, the hows and the whys, and the development of the public health orders, how they impact the communities of faith, and the distinction between them and the guidelines that we are receiving from the governor's office. I will be soliciting questions from our faith leaders beginning today through next week that Dr. Aragon has agreed to answer. We are very much looking forward. It's a very timely conversation. So it will be a different format. I'm just sharing that with you right now. We look forward to seeing all of you next week and more. And that concludes our program today. Go in peace and God bless.